The scent of salt and gunpowder was a foul mixture, a stench that seemed to cling to the skin. Captain Émile Dubois wiped the sweat from his temple with the palm of his left hand, his vision blurred behind the cracked lens of his glasses. It was a clean crack, a line that cut his view of his homeland in two, a bitter premonition he preferred to ignore. The landscape of Dunkirk around him was a painting of chaos and desperation, with the sea mist and the black smoke from the fires merging on the horizon. The constant drone of the Luftwaffe bombers filled the air like a swarm of metallic bees, but in his mind it was just an echo. He had heard that sound before, the sound of a war that never ends. In front of him, the beach was filled with a mass of men, mostly British, but also Belgians and a few groups of French soldiers, all huddled in a state of agonizing waiting. Captain Émile could feel the damp, salty scent of the sea mingling with the acrid smell of fear and the sweat of the men. He observed the face of one soldier, too young for war, who seemed on the verge of hysteria. Émile did not judge. He had seen that same expression on the faces of his friends in the past. He had felt it on his own skin, but time and grief had transformed his fear into a kind of weary numbness, a burden he carried like his rifle, with the resignation of a veteran. "Captain, the British have already embarked most of their troops," said Sergeant Adjoint Pierre Moreau, his clean, naive face contrasting with the dirt and exhaustion that marked the rest of the company. Pierre had a hope in his eyes that was almost painful to see, the hope of someone who does not know the true hell of war. "It shouldn't be long until our turn." Émile did not answer right away. Pierre's voice was young, full of a youthful bravery that had not yet been tested by total defeat. Pierre believed in the plan, in the logic they had been taught: retreat, regroup, counterattack. He did not understand that the war of 1914 was not the war of 1914. It was something swift, overwhelming, relentless, a lightning war, a term that the Western press had already adopted. The French infantry, which for the most part still used equipment from 1916, had not been made for this kind of fight. "Pierre," Émile finally said, his voice low, forcing the sergeant to lean in to hear him, "we are not embarking." Pierre went pale, the bravery fleeing from his eyes like a startled animal. "What do you mean, sir?" "Our mission is to hold the position, not for our own evacuation, but so that the evacuation can continue. We are the rear guard." The term rear guard felt heavy, loaded with a somber meaning. He did not need to say anything more. They both knew that the rear guard does not survive the retreat. Private Jean-Luc Martin, a robust peasant from Normandy, with a constant anxiety on his face, approached them. "What did he mean, Captain? Why are we moving inland toward the barricades? My God, I just want to go home, to Marie and the boys. They need me. Can't we just run to the sea?" Émile looked at Jean-Luc's broad shoulders, which were trembling slightly. He saw the image of a simple and honest life, a farm, a wife, the smell of wet earth. He felt the man's pain, the pain of a future being stolen. And in his mind, Émile was transported back to Verdun 26 years earlier, the smell of mud, the sound of his friend Pierre, hit by a mortar, Pierre's face, the metallic smell of blood. Émile had failed in Verdun, and now Jean-Luc's face seemed like a ghost from the past. He felt the guilt transform into a physical burden, heavier than his rifle. Émile placed his hand on Jean-Luc's shoulder. The firmness of his touch conveyed the only thing he could offer at that moment: resolve. "The only way you can get home, Jean-Luc, is by fulfilling our mission. If we fall, no one else will have the chance to return." The answer seemed to calm Jean-Luc for a moment. He nodded, swallowing hard, his calloused hand tightening on the rifle stock. Émile turned away, the pain in his eyes obscured by the mist and smoke of Dunkirk. The promise of redemption was the only thing that kept him standing, and he would do everything in his power to ensure that the promise of life for his men, even if it were a lie, became a reality. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension. A low, continuous growl came from the northeast, the sound of German panzers and their accompanying infantry drawing ever closer, a relentless, mechanical tide. Émile and his men had taken up positions along a series of cobbled streets, barricading windows with overturned furniture and sandbags. The plan was grim in its simplicity. Make them pay for every inch of ground, bleed them dry so that the men on the beach could live to fight another day. The urgency of their situation was a physical thing, a cold knot in Émile's gut. He wiped his hands on his trousers, the coarse fabric of the old M1916 uniform feeling like sandpaper against his skin, a stark reminder of another war he had barely survived. The first wave of Germans hit with terrifying speed, not the slow, methodical advance of the Great War, but a sudden, violent eruption of fire and steel. It was the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war the newspapers spoke of. The sheer speed of the attack was unsettling. They were not fighting a line of men, but a fast-moving storm of tanks and mechanized infantry, a far cry from the static trench warfare Émile knew so well. The air was thick with the scent of cordite and pulverized stone. The smell of fear, he knew, was odorless, but its presence was absolute. He watched as a mortar shell shrieked overhead, a sound that made his stomach lurch and landed with a sickening thump down the street. The whistle of the mortar was a key turning in a rusted lock inside his mind. He was no longer in Dunkirk. He was back in the mud of Verdun, 1916. The trench was a stinking gash in the earth, filled with water and the constant drone of flies. A young man with bright eyes and a wide, hopeful smile, a man he had called his friend, turned to him, his mouth moving in a silent plea before the world turned into a roaring inferno of light and sound. Émile felt the gritty texture of mud on his tongue, the cold dampness seeping into his bones. His hand, once holding a rifle in 1940, now felt the phantom grip of his friend's hand, a desperate final squeeze. He had not been able to pull him to safety. The guilt was a heavy iron ball in his chest, a burden he had carried for 24 years, an emotional and psychological exhaustion that had never truly healed. A shout from Pierre snapped him back to the present. "Captain, they're pushing forward!" Émile tightened his grip on his rifle, the cold steel grounding him. He looked at Pierre, so young and full of a brittle courage. He heard Jean-Luc's voice, a little shaky but resolute, as he told another soldier that he just had to make it through because his family was waiting for him at home. He had a wife and 2 sons, and he had to return to them. Jean-Luc's desire was a simple, pure thing, a desire Émile no longer possessed for himself. All Émile wanted was for these men to get out, to be safe from the carnage he knew was inevitable. This was his chance to fix the past, to make a different choice. He would not fail his men this time. He would not lose them to the specters of Verdun. He watched the German advance, the sight of their gray uniforms and menacing helmets a cold promise of death. The men returned fire, the desperate bursts of their rifles swallowed by the thunder of enemy machine guns. The line of defense held, but only barely. A bullet ricocheted off the wall near Émile's head, the sound sharp and close. He did not flinch. He saw no reason to. The roar of the battle was a symphony of destruction, and his part in it was to conduct it to its tragic final crescendo. The German advance was relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they were overrun, a grim fact Émile had accepted long ago.
He just needed to buy a few more minutes, a few more precious seconds for the men escaping to the sea. The tension mounted. The Germans were too many, too fast, their advance a relentless assault that left no room for hope. Another wave of mortars rained down, shaking the buildings around them to their foundations. The taste of dust filled Émile's mouth. His vision was a chaotic blur of gray uniforms and the flashes of gunfire, a new reality that was fast becoming indistinguishable from the hell of his memories.
The low growl had turned into a full-throated roar. The German assault, a methodical machine of death, pressed forward with an unnerving, almost casual brutality. Émile's men were a small, defiant line against the gray wave. The air was no longer just thick with smoke and the metallic smell of gunpowder. It was a storm of noise, a symphony of shrapnel tearing through brick and wood. The buildings that had offered them a semblance of cover were crumbling. The sound of a mortar shell whistling down was the last thing he heard before the world turned into a deafening, concussion-filled silence that felt heavier than any sound. When Émile's hearing returned, it was a dull, ringing hum, as if his head were a bell that had just been struck. The world was a blur of dust and fire. He could taste the coppery tang of blood in his mouth, the result of a burst eardrum. He stumbled, shaking his head to clear the fog. He could feel the cold, wet sand and rubble under his hands as he pushed himself up. It was then that he saw it, the flash of something small and metallic near where Jean-Luc had been moments before. He saw it happen. Jean-Luc, the farmer, the father, had been taking a quick moment to adjust his position, his broad shoulders hunched against the inevitable. He'd reached into his breast pocket, a simple, nervous gesture, and a small silver locket had slipped from his grasp. Émile saw Jean-Luc's eyes, full of a fleeting panic as he looked down at the trinket. It was a moment of vulnerability in the middle of a storm, a connection to the world he was fighting to return to. A new burst of gunfire from a concealed position ripped through the air, and Jean-Luc, caught in the open, fell. The sight of Jean-Luc's body, his life ebbing away in the dust and debris, hit Émile with a force that had nothing to do with the physical battle. It was a cold, quiet rage, a profound and weary confirmation of his deepest fear. He had promised to protect these men, just as he had promised to protect his friends in the trenches of Verdun so long ago. But here, in this new war, he was just as helpless, just as impotent. The guilt, that old, familiar demon, rose from the pit of his stomach, hotter and more bitter than the taste of blood in his mouth. The death of his comrades was a wound that had never healed. Émile felt a shift in himself. The exhaustion, the cynicism, the detached resignation, it was all gone, replaced by a cold, surgical fury. He was no longer fighting for France or for a lost cause. He was fighting for Jean-Luc, for the memory of his wife and sons, for all the simple, beautiful lives that war had snuffed out. This was not about glory or heroism. It was about honoring the forgotten, a debt he owed not only to Jean-Luc, but to all the ghosts of his past. He grabbed a rifle and emptied it into the German position. He reloaded with a mechanical, practiced ease, each movement precise and efficient. The sound of his own breathing was the only thing he could hear above the cacophony, a ragged, burning sound in his ears. He barked orders to his remaining men, his voice a strained whisper, but his authority was absolute. They looked at him, their faces pale with fear, and saw not a defeated man, but a man possessed by a grim and terrible resolve. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to make the Germans pay for the hope they had just extinguished. The last of their defensive line was about to be overrun. But Émile, on his knees,
his left hand gripping the hilt of a bayonet, felt a strange kind of peace settle over him. He was no longer fleeing from his past. He was facing it head-on, in the dust and the chaos of a city that was bleeding to death. The metallic taste of blood, the coarse grains of sand under his fingernails, the sudden, terrible silence that followed a mortar blast, it was all here, and he was finally ready to meet it.
The barrage intensified. The air was a cacophony of explosions and the splintering of stone, a grim symphony that signaled the end. The German advance was relentless, a cold, unfeeling tide of steel and men. They had been pushed back from the main road into a labyrinth of narrow, crumbling alleys. Émile moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, shouting orders that were swallowed by the noise. He was no longer a man, he was a function, a machine of war, his mind a steel trap of tactics and grim necessity. It was during a brief lull, the silence more terrifying than the noise, that it happened. A single sharp crack of a sniper rifle. Émile saw it before he heard it, the sudden violent lurch of Pierre's body as a bullet tore through his shoulder. The young sergeant fell against a wall, his face a mask of shock and pain, his rifle clattering to the ground. He looked at Émile, his eyes wide and pleading, the innocence in them now replaced by a dawning terror. Émile was at his side in an instant, his left hand pressing a makeshift bandage against the wound. He felt the slick warmth of blood on his fingers, a sticky, visceral reality in the middle of a dying world. Pierre's breath was a shallow, ragged gasp. The young man looked up at him, a weak, fleeting smile on his lips as he spoke of his hope for a future free from war, a future he was now certain he would never see. He said he was fighting for the beautiful France his father had told him about, the one where the fields were green and not scarred by craters and trenches. The words were a direct hit to Émile's mind. The phrase, fighting for the France his father had told him about, was a sentence from a book he had read, a history he had lived. The world tilted and dissolved into a nauseating blur of gray and green. He was no longer in the shattered alleys of Dunkirk. He was in the mud, in the abyss of Verdun, 24 years ago. He could feel the cold dampness of the trench floor seeping into his boots, the cloying smell of stagnant water and unwashed bodies. The sky above was a bruised canvas of gray, perpetually choked with smoke. He was a young man then, filled with a foolish, untested idealism, a belief in a cause that would soon be shattered. The trench was a stinking gash in the earth, filled with water and the constant drone of flies. A young man, barely older than Pierre, turned to him with a hopeful, boyish grin, a man Émile called his friend. He was speaking, his mouth moving in a silent plea before the world was consumed by a deafening roar and a blinding flash of light from a mortar shell. Émile had been frozen, helpless. He felt the phantom grip of his friend's hand, a desperate, final squeeze as the earth erupted around them. The taste of mud and terror filled his mouth. He had been so close, so agonizingly close to pulling his friend to safety, but the mud had held him fast, and the blast had taken everything else. The guilt was not a memory, it was a physical weight, an iron ball in his chest that had been growing heavier with every passing year, every fallen comrade. Émile was back in Dunkirk, the noise of the battle now a fresh, brutal reality. The ringing in his ears was the echo of both wars. He looked at Pierre, the young man's final breath a shudder against his chest. Pierre's face was calm now, the terror replaced by a quiet peace. He was a second ghost in a long procession, a new wound on a scar that had never truly healed. Émile's eyes, a faded blue, welled up with a grief so profound and ancient it felt as if it belonged to the very soil beneath him. The sacrifice of this innocent young man, the death of a hope he could no longer afford to feel, was the final weight that broke the last of his emotional defenses. He had promised to keep his men safe,
just as he had promised himself he would never again lose a friend. He had failed both times. He laid Pierre's body gently on the ground, his touch respectful, almost paternal. The last of the company was scattered or dead. There was no one else to protect, no one else to fight for, just the ghosts of the past and the finality of the present. He stood up, his posture straight, the exhaustion gone, replaced by a grim, focused energy. His left hand, still stained with blood, felt a strange kind of peace. His personal war, the one he had been fighting for 24 years, was about to end, and this time he was not running.
The silence that followed Pierre's last breath was absolute, a terrible calm after the storm. It was a stillness that Émile had not experienced since before the First War. He was alone now. Jean-Luc was a crumpled mass of cloth and hope a few feet away, and Pierre, the young idealist, was a still, cold weight in his arms. The last of his company was gone. The grand, chaotic escape of the British was long over, and with it, any hope of his own survival. The sound of distant mortar fire and the hum of unseen airplanes were the only remaining notes in the grim symphony of this forgotten corner of Dunkirk. Émile looked at his stained left hand, his mind a maelstrom of memories. He saw the faces of the friends he had lost in Verdun, their youthful optimism shattered by the mud and fire of the trenches, an optimism he now saw in the unmoving face of Pierre. The guilt he had carried for 2 decades, that deep-seated sense of failure, had now become a cold, sharp blade. It no longer paralyzed him. It now gave him a terrible, clear purpose. He had failed them then, but he would not fail them now. He would ensure their deaths were not meaningless. The German footsteps were getting closer, the sound of their boots on the broken stone almost casual in their certainty. They were not expecting resistance. The Allied front had collapsed so swiftly that resistance was considered a foolish myth. But Émile was no longer fighting for a cause or an army. He was fighting for his dead. He was a sentinel for the forgotten, a last desperate act of defiance for the men who would never see their homes again. He carefully laid Pierre down beside Jean-Luc, straightening his coat and closing his eyes with a gentle touch, a father to his fallen sons. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the smell of smoke and salt, and retrieved a small, tarnished medal from his pocket, a medal of the First World War. He laid it gently on Pierre's chest. This was his last act, his final connection to the past, a silent promise to the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. He stood, his old rifle feeling lighter now, his body a simple vessel for a grim and terrible resolve. He heard them now, their voices low, their language harsh and guttural. He could smell their leather, the faint scent of cigarettes and grease. He could see their silhouettes against the smoke-filled light of the burning city and approaching wall of gray. He was one man against a company, a final, futile gesture. But it wasn't about winning. It was about making stand, about giving his soul, at last, a rest. Émile did not try to hide. He did not run. He stepped out from the shadows of a crumbling building, his rifle raised, his eyes clear and unblinking. The Germans were surprised for a moment, and in that moment, Émile opened fire. He fired with a furious precision, emptying his magazine, each shot a final farewell to the past, a final tribute to his fallen friends. A searing pain tore through his chest as a German bullet found its mark. He stumbled, but did not fall, his body running on pure, unadulterated will. He felt his blood bubbling in his throat, a metallic taste he knew all too well from his memories of Verdun. He saw the Germans return fire, a storm of bullets tearing through his worn coat, through his very being. He sank to his knees, his vision blurring, the sounds of the world fading to a low, distant hum. His last thought was not of defeat. It was of his friends, their faces smiling, their souls finally at peace.
He had given them time. He had held the line. He had paid his debt. Hours later, after the main German force had moved on, a young French civilian, scavenging for supplies, found the small group of bodies. He saw the young man, the father, and the old captain. He saw the medal on the captain's chest, a testament to a war that had ended 2 decades before. He didn't know the story of these men, but he knew what they had done. He carefully picked up the medal, his fingers tracing the worn image of a woman, a farm, a family. He understood. This was not a story of defeat. It was a story of silence, of an untold heroism. A story waiting to be remembered. The war had taken a final, silent toll on a small, forgotten corner of France. But in the quiet courage of a single man, a flicker of light had been kept alive, a promise honored in the shadows. And that, in the end, was the only victory that mattered.